Okay, so brief explanation of how Borescope and Pullover works. Brief explanation. You have... Now, chat, I'm sure... Try not to be too distracted by this absolutely amazing image of a mortar tube, okay? Try not to be too distracted by this amazing image of a mortar tube. It is very incredible. I know. You're going to be absolutely blown away. So this is your mortar tube. That's the firing pin. This is what the inside of the mortar tube looks like. The way Borescope and Pullover works is the Borescope is quite literally a... It's basically a thing that goes down into the mortar tube, just like this. They have newer Borescopes that are substantially better. But the ones that I had while I was in the military were like... I don't know why I always say while I was in the military, because I was in the army. So, the ones I had while I was in the army were like this. Where this thing right here was a mirror. So basically, and there was like a lens down on the other end down here, right? And then the mirror would just show you what the inside of the mortar tube looked like. And you would rotate it around. The newer Borescopes are all like cameras and you can like take photos of stuff. They're really cool. The old ones were made in like the 70s and we were still using them. Because I want you guys to remember, I joined the army when they were still issuing woodland camouflage BDUs. So I'm old. Anyway, so that's what Borescope is. Now, if you need to do Borescope on a mortar, I'm sure that you literally could just get one of those flexible inspection cameras and just look down the inside of the mortar tube. The way Pullover works is you had a gauge that you would... This is going to be an absolutely amazing gauge, chat. I want you guys to make sure you don't lose your minds. I want you guys to make sure you don't lose your minds. You had a gauge that looked kind of like this. And I'm drawing it at a weird angle, okay? I'm drawing it at a weird angle. There were two pivots attached to the end of the gauge that attached to two sticks that went all the way out the end of the mortar tube. What you would do is you would slide this gauge into the mortar tube and you would pull this one this way and you would push this one this way. So we have the first part of it, right? This is the first part of how the Borescope and Pullover works. The way this gauge looked is it looked like... If you're looking at this gauge from the top, it looks like this. And it is two pieces of metal. This is basically like a... This here is a dovetail joint. When you pull the two different pieces to the left and right, what happens is this piece right here can move in and out. Hold, please. This piece right here can move in and out. So they're basically two different pieces of metal. One is shaped like this. No jokes, please. The other one is shaped like this. And the two pieces can slide in and out, right? So when you pull the mortar gauge like this, this piece is going to slide inwards and give you what the measurement between here and here is. So what you do is you slide the entire pullover gauge into the mortar tube. You pull it backwards, take it out of the mortar tube, and then you use a set of calipers to measure what this distance is. Because at this point, this is now what this diameter is. Because you can't reach all the way down into the mortar tube to check it. So you do that like 3 times at the end of the mortar tube, at the middle of the mortar tube, and at the muzzle of the mortar tube. And then you take averages of what those 3 times are, and then that gives you what the pullover reading is. The manual lists what the measurements can be, like what the allowable measurement can be is. And what's interesting is when you do pullover on mortar tubes, down here towards the end of the muzzle is going to get more eroded than towards the muzzle of the mortar. Because this is where the fucking explosion is. So this gets more eroded than it does down at the end of it. It's actually kind of neat. I hated doing it while I was in the military, but now that I'm out of the military, it's really cool. It's not checking for loose spots, but it is checking for interior bulges because, and I'm gonna need to make the canvas bigger again really quick. I'm sorry that I'm like spending a bunch of time on this. I know you guys like hearing me talk about gun shit, but it's kind of ridiculous. So, how can I do this? Can I do shift doesn't really work. The more you fire a mortar tube, when you have a mortar tube, it's basically, ideally you want it to be 2 completely parallel lines. But the more you fire it, the more worn it's going to start getting. Especially towards the end, where the end cap is. So the metal itself, because you're just repeatedly setting off explosions in here over and over again, the metal is going to actually start bulging outwards like this. And that is what you're checking for on the inside of a mortar tube, is the metal getting eroded and bulging. Anyway, there you go. I just did a really bad job of explaining how Borescope and Pullover works. You're welcome.
Hear ye. A gifted subscription.
Thank you very much, anonymous gifter, for the gifted subscription. I really appreciate it. All right, back to coin game. Ugh. Why do I like top break revolvers? For me, it's just because it looks cool. Yeah, same reason. They look cool. How many times can a mortar be used before it becomes unusable? That actually depends on a lot of different things. It depends on what mortars you're firing through it and how much propellant you are putting on each mortar. Because you can actually increase or decrease the amount of propellant you put on the mortar to make it go farther or closer. So obviously, if you take a mortar and... Okay, good. Obviously, if you take a mortar and you put the most propellant you possibly can on it, and you do that every single time, that will wear the mortar tube out faster. Booster rings, yeah, they're little, like, they look like a little C-shaped donut. They look like a little donut with a C, or like a bite taken out of it. And you put those on the back of the mortar. And then that determines how much farther it will go.